Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1310. Closer to the bottom of 1310. And discussing the meaning of Lahayeres HaCheshech. After a longer elaboration, how we illuminate the darkness, meaning the godliness that is shrouded and concealed in this world, that's called the state of darkness, by awakening, stimulating the emotions toward the divine through contemplating the details of the contemplation of the divine soul, to the point that also the animal soul understands it, and therefore creates a longing and a wanting to connect to the divine. So what's Lahayeres HaCheshech? It goes back, means not just to dispel darkness, but to transform darkness. To understand that, and to explain that, he began with the two opinions. Yesh Beis is two opinions in what darkness is, the very entity called Cheshech. One opinion that it's only the absence of light, and therefore it's only possible once there's light, so you can have the absence of light, or in a place where the light doesn't reach, so that's where there's darkness. Or is darkness an entity and a substance of its own, bria b'fnei atzma, as he put it. And that means even if there's no light, you could have darkness. And indeed, darkness can proceed and does precede light, as we say in the Torah, that first it was dark, cheshech, and then vayemer elikim yehi or, there should be light. And he brought several proofs toward that, including that verse. And then yetzer eira beira cheshech means he creates darkness, and also from the Maimer Azal that v'cheshech mishtamshim barvuvi, in the beginning of creation, they both were like a mixture of light and dark. That's another. And finally, that first came darkness, then came light. And finally, and one more. He rolls away the light in the face of darkness, and turns away and rolls away darkness in the face of light. All this indicates that it's not just an absence of light, that Cheshech has its own substance, its own reality, its own entity. And this, he says, and when you say Lahayeres HaCheshech, when you say to illuminate darkness, it has two different meanings based on these two different opinions. If Cheshech is only the absence of light, so then when you say to illuminate darkness means you're dispelling darkness. Then the whole meaning of it is simply fill up light, and automatically darkness gets dispelled because darkness has no substance. But if you say Cheshech is a bria b'fnei atzma, it's its own creation, then the kavanah in radiating and illuminating the darkness means not just to dispel the darkness, which would then say, but rather the ultimate purpose that the Cheshech itself, that substance called darkness, should become light. And he actually says, because by dispelling it, you haven't really eliminated it. You've just pushed it aside because light is dominating. Whereas in the second interpretation, you want to also transform that no longer darkness can be dark, because darkness itself becomes light. That's where we stopped. 6 lines from the bottom of the page. Now, just for the record, this entire piece, much of the language in this piece comes from Share Eira, which is the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer and B'chafei Kislev, a Chanukah Maimer Share Eira of the Mittler Rebbe, I believe chapter 27, around there, where he discusses this, and some of the language here is actually straight from there. There's also a Maimer Vayikach Hashem Elikim Bereshis Tofrei Sadik Hey from the Frierdiker Rebbe in the Seif Maimorim Kontresim Volume 2, which is based on this piece as well. And as I mentioned, the Rebbe brings this in a footnote in a discourse in Tafshin Ches from the Frierdiker Rebbe. he brings the two opinions. He actually brings where the sources are, who holds each opinion about darkness. In Chazal, in the sages, we have different sources, and that they're really, at the end of the day, they're not two opinions, they're two levels of darkness, and one follows the other, as he's going to explain now. So right now, we established that there's two opinions, and the two opinions inform what it means to radiate darkness. And the ultimate goal is to transform, not just to dispel. Okay. So now we'll
You're
continue.
referring to the Tzemach Tzedek when you said the Rebbe?
Okay.
You said when the Rebbe distinguishes between two and gives the sources for the two opinions, you're referring to the Tzemach Tzedek?
What's Tzemach Tzedek?
You said there's a mimer.
There's a mimer.
I'm sorry. You said the Mittler Rebbe. I'm sorry. You said the Mittler Rebbe.
Yeah, Shari Eira from the Mittler Rebbe. He talks about it in the Mimer Chanukah B'Chafei B'Kislev, I think chapter 27. And the Friedrich Rebbe's Mimer. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
You don't need to say sorry. It's all right.
Okay.
Okay, so now we continue reading inside. Umakol Mokim, I'm reading from 6 lines from the bottom of page 1310, which can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow the actual text. Okay. Umakol Mokim says that Rabbi Rashab, and nevertheless, so now clearly you see, even though till now it seemed like there are two different opinions, two exclusively different opinions, he's now saying the truth is, B'kol Mokim, they're both things in Cheshach. Cheshach has both dimensions. So initially it's two opinions, but as I pointed out, it's actually two dimensions in Cheshach. There's two things in Cheshach. Mashu B'riya B'fnei Atzmei. One thing in darkness is that it's a separate entity, separate creation, meaning it's not just an absence of light, so then it would just be in relation to light. And the second aspect of darkness is that it is the absence of light. So there's actually two elements to darkness. And now he's going to explain what that means. This means Etzem HaCheshach, the very essence of the darkness, that's a separate entity. So the very fact that there's a thing called darkness is an entity, just like there is a daimim tzemeach chaim medab, just like there are trees and there are stones and there are other objects in existence, there's a thing called darkness. We're not talking about the personality of darkness. We're just talking about this entity called darkness. Then there's something else about darkness. The fact that it conceals, that it darkens, machshich ala eir, that it covers up on eir, meaning it darkens a bright place. So there's light in a room, or there's daylight. Cheshach means that the light the light is no longer there. It's talking more about the personality of Cheshach, of what it does. Shamaylam olav, that it conceals on the light. Umagbeloisei, and limits the light, umeinea hispashtus v'gilei, and it impedes or blocks the expansion and the revelation of light. So if you have to say light is shining into your window, and you put up a curtain or a completely what do they say? Opaque, not opaque. What's a curtain that completely darkens the entire room? Is that called opaque? No, that's called.
That's correct.
Yeah,
it's correct.
So, okay. So what does it do? So it darkens the room and it basically blocks out the light. So there's two things he says in Cheshach. What it is, the etzem etzias HaCheshach. He says, etzem HaCheshach, and the fact that its effect on light. Now, based on what he's describing now, the effect on light sounds like it's not just the absence of light. Because the absence of light is not that the darkness is concealing, is that the light is not there, and therefore there's darkness. So it's interesting, is when he's explaining now that there's both aspects to it, the question is, does he really mean the absence of light? Or does he mean that its property is one that blocks light? Just pointing that out. I don't want to come to any conclusion. I want to see how he's going to explain it now. But bottom line is, he said now there's two things in cheshach. So based on that, in a way, there's not really a disagreement. It depends what they're focusing on. Are they focusing on the absence of light aspect that is blocking out light? Or are they focusing on the very entity called darkness? That would be the different opinions based on what he just says now. I really want to look it up again in Shiur Eira for the Mittler Rebbe and see, and also the Maimer from the Mittler, from the Friedrich Rebbe, how they explain it.
The opaque is not the choshech. It's not a choshech malim. It's something that malim.
Well, he says here, a choshech is malim, machshich ala'er, shemalim alov, I just use that as an example. But it's the same idea. When you say Geilel Cheshach, Geilel Er Mepnei Cheshach, in other words, there's a darkness that's entering and concealing and limiting and blocking out the light. I just use it as an example. Okay. But my thing is that according to this, Cheshach is a Metzias, but then its function is one like that. Okay, let's hold the thought. We'll get back to it.
You're right. It's not Heller or oil. It looks like he's explaining the Choshech itself is having based in Yonim.
Well, he does say Mashu Eheder Oil. In other words, according to this explanation, its function is one of blocking out and limiting or the light. Yeah. Let's see how he explains it. And as I said, I want to look it up again in those Maimorim to see exactly how it's understood. Because in the two opinions, it's pretty clear that Cheshach has no Metzias altogether, according to the opinion that it's just absence of light. In other words, it's like almost like Keren Zovius. Remember the Keren Zovius? It doesn't really have an existence. It's when two walls come together, you have a corner. Darkness, it doesn't have any existence. It's when there's no light, that's called darkness. But here he's clearly speaking about it in a deeper way. The Rebbe's Ha'ara I want to look at as well. The Rebbe's Ha'ara in Tafshin Ches, he elaborates on it a bit. I'll look it up. Okay. The Yuvan Zeh, now remember, all this is coming to explain what we want to understand is the transformation, not just the dispelling of darkness. Like, for example, when you say ignorance and wisdom, you know, the Pasuk says, "V're'isi ani she'yashisin ha'chochma min ha'sichlos ki yisun ha'er min ha'cheshach." That chochma over nonsense, over folly, over foolishness, has an advantage like light over darkness. So when you say somebody is ignorant, right? Is ignorance an entity of its own, or it's just the lack and absence of intelligence? So in most cases, you'd say it's just the absence of intelligence. And the best proof of it is because if you teach that person and you educate them, then you've brought the light into them. And then it's in a form of, there's no longer that type of darkness or that type of ignorance. Now, obviously, we know there are people who deliberately want to be destructive or are deliberately ignorant. That's another story where that person is a force of, but generally speaking, ignorance is simply a lack of, an absence of something. It's not a power of its own. That's why Chachma is always going to dominate over wisdom. I'm sorry, wisdom is going to dominate over some, a smarter person is always going to be superior to a person who's less smart because simply because it's like the absence of that. Like light would automatically dispel darkness. That's one of the proofs that darkness doesn't have substance of its own. But he's also here explained that it does have substance of its own. Anyways, I said I'll elaborate more. I just thinking out loud a bit based on what he's explaining now. I think we'll continue to read, and I said I will double check with the sources and get back to you with more information on this. The Yuvan Zal Derech Mashal, and we'll understand this like for example, with an example. B'keiches hanefesh, with an example in the faculties of the soul, the faculties of a person. Hamislapshim be'evri haguf, the faculties of the nefesh that manifest and enclose in the limbs or organs of the body. He's going to use that as an example now to explain this. Hare, hakech is boyim b'akshama. These faculties, let's say the power of vision in the eye. So the power of vision is a koyach benefesh, which is mislabish, manifests in the ayin gashmi, in your physical eye, just like the power of hearing manifests in the oizen gashmi, in the physical ear. So these koyches, when they manifest within these parts of our body, they don't remain in the same sublime state and sublime state and subtle state as they are before they manifest. Boyim b'akshama, they come in a form of akshama. What's the word? They assume some substance, because it's not just a abstract power of vision. The vision now is actually using the eye to see, and that's why you could see physical things. If you were talking about the koyach hariyah beruchnius in heaven, it may not be able to see the physical. So the koyches, as they manifest, that's why it's called islapshus. If you remember, we learned islapshus is not passing through. The faculties actually assume the properties of the physical organs or limbs in which they manifest. Say boim b'akshama u'b'hagbola b'islapshus zeis. So they come into a somewhat more substance levels. They assume some substance. Akshama means it's more physical, more tangible, more palpable, ubagbola, and more limited in a limited way, bislapshus in this process of being enclosed. So in other words, okay, he's going to explain why. I thought he's not going to explain. He's going to explain why. Sharia koiches, because the faculties on their own, the koiches be'etzem on their own before they manifest. If you just were able to dissect the anatomy of a faculty, not as it manifests inside of a body, just the faculty says, hein ruchnim be'etzem. They're fundamentally sublime and of spirit. Ruchnim, it doesn't necessarily mean kedusha, holy. It just means they're not physical. To say for example, the power of sight is as physical as the physical eye, absolutely not. The power of sight is still somewhat of a subtle power. But on its own, it's ruchnim be'etzem mahusam, in its core personality. Kamoy ruchnis hanefesh atzma, just like the nefesh itself, just like the spirit and the sublimeness of the soul itself. So even though the soul gives life to the body and comes alive in the body, we feel like we're alive. So the soul too has become somewhat ba'akshama, but the soul be'etzem is a ruchni. Soul and body are two separate realities. They just join together. God dresses them like a hand inside of a glove, but the hand and glove are not exactly the same properties. So it assumes b'akshama, but on its own, it fundamentally etzem mahusam, it's ruchnim. And even though they're only faculties, they're not the soul itself. We're not talking about the etzem hanefesh. We're not talking about the soul itself. We're talking about faculties of the soul. Shein giluyim protim ma nefesh. In other words, they're one step below the nefesh, because they're giluyim protim. They're specific channels of revelation, revelatory channels from the nefesh. B'chinas chachma is one channel. Ubina is another one. V'chesed. These are all faculties of the soul, so they're not quite the soul itself. They're faculties, they're giluyim from the soul, so they're like revealing channels from the soul. Shanefesh atzma mushlalish mezeh. So even though they are not the nefesh, and the nefesh itself negates this very structure, because the nefesh is not made up of parts. The nefesh is the source of these faculties, but the nefesh itself, mushlalis means it does not, it means negate, it negates it, but mushlalis also means it, I don't want to use the word repel, it's not repels it, it just defies, that's the word. It defies the definition of faculties. When you say nefesh, you're talking about a nefesh pshuta, a seamless soul. When you say faculties, they're not seamless. Chachma is not bina. And yet, B'kol Mokem, and nevertheless, next page, 13.
You're having a dugma between you have an example that you could understand the
let me just finish the phrase and then I'll go back to it. So I'm on top of 1311. Makol mokem. So even though the keiches are not the nefesh itself, but they're also not the body. Harihem keiches ruchnim. Nevertheless, they are still sublime and subtle faculties, ethereal faculties, you can say. Ethereal is a good word here. In a state of abundant revelation, and the form of unlimitedness, because they're not defined by the body yet. In other words, if you said purely from the soul level, how far can you see? If you didn't have a body, the power of sight shouldn't have any limits. Just like the power of the soul doesn't have limits how much energy it has, because it's ruchni is be'etzem. It's only when it goes into the body that it's limited by the body's capacity. Like if someone were to say to you, the power to throw a stone, that's simply because the body only has that much strength and your muscles are limited. But the very power to throw in the nefesh is unlimited. Like, for example, the unlimited power, you can write in an unlimited way. It's just that your body is going to get worn down or your body is going to get tired. And at some point, you can't keep on writing, just like you can't keep on walking. But the koyach itself is still a sublime one on its own. So what we have here really is three levels. There's the nefesh itself. That's a purely seamless power of energy, like electricity. There's the nefesh has faculties. Faculties are specific soul faculties, wisdom, chachma, bina, seeing, hearing. And then there's the body, the parts of the body, like the eyes and the ears, where those faculties manifest. So all this is using as an example that in keiches hanefesh, which manifest in the body, the faculties which on their own are sublime, assume some form of substance, some form of tangibility and palpability. But on their own, they're spiritual, like the nefesh is. And even though he qualified that it's not mamish like the nefesh, because the nefesh is completely seamless, but nevertheless, they're keiches ruchnim, and on their own, they're in a b'chinas ribi gili eir, b'chinas bli gvul. And he explains, sha'koyach ha'seichel shabenefesh. Like the koyach, the power of intelligence in the nefesh. Remember, a body does not have intelligence. A body is just an inanimate vehicle. When the neshama leaves the body, God forbid, after 120 years, the body does not retain any faculties, no more faculties. The faculties are not working. The eyes are intact, the ears can be intact, the mind, the brain is intact. And yet, since there's no koiches hanefesh outward, because the nefesh is removed, the body is a lifeless and just a piece of daimon. In the language of the brisker, a gavra became a chefze. So that's the body. The faculties themselves are soulful faculties. Though they're not the soul itself, they're channels of gilui protim ma'nefesh, like he said, but on their own, they don't have this limit. And he's explaining, the power of intelligence in the nefesh. We're not talking about the brain now. We're talking about the faculty called seichel. Hula haskil, it's to conceive, ula hasig, elikus, and to understand godliness, comprehend godliness, gambe madregas elyenis, also in the higher levels of godliness, vahaskola vahasaga, on its own, the soul on its own, the haskola and hasaga, the conceiving and the comprehension, he be'efen nifla. It's in a wondrous, it's in a wondrous way. L'mayla harbe ma'asagas hamalachim. Far greater and far higher than the comprehension and understanding of angels. And we're talking about the nefesh on its own. Why? Because the soul is a spiritual entity. So its capacity to understand godliness goes to very high levels. This is the keiches on their own. The klolos hasaga, and in general, this hasaga on the neshama itself, on the koyach haseichel of the neshama, hui b'muhus haruchni. What does it understand? It doesn't understand things in a physical way. It's b'mhusa ruchni. The hasag is on a level of a spiritual person, a spirit personality, an ethereal personality type of understanding. Like the comprehension of souls in Gan Eden, where there's only neshamas without bodies, souls without bodies. Like the understanding of the souls in Gan Eden, which is in the higher worlds, in the personality of the divine energy. That's the seichel of the koiches hanefesh. And the same thing, the same thing, the work, the work, the service of these souls in love and reverence, is also on a high and very exalted level. To the point of bittul, in a level of bittul mitzias, where it's completely nullified. There's no sense of self. It's all about the divine. Chai Hashem asher amadeti lefanov. That's referring to a bittul, because Chai Hashem asher amadeti, the God that I stand before him, amadeti lefanov is a state of bittul. I'm completely sublimated, completely nullified in the presence of God. This is all the koiches hanefesh on their own. Now he's going to bring it back to what he wants to explain here to understand the idea of choshech that he was going to speak about before, that how it conceals. He says, when these faculties, these sublime faculties now get enclosed and manifest in the limbs of the body, they come now and they assume something more of substance. In Gan Eden or on their own, they're completely sublime. But once they come into a body, into the level of the faculty of the organ, the limbs of the body, they come back shama. What does that mean? Then the power of intelligence is limited by the body. It's not be'erech klal. It's not commensurate at all. It's not at all relates lahaskil mashahoyi b'cholti lahaskil kodim islapshuse. It's not capable of conceiving what was capable of being conceived before this seichel entered into the body. So in other words, the very power of intelligence that's on its own, once it comes into the body, does not have the same capacity. When we use our minds to contemplate on God down below, here, we don't have the same capacity as it is when it's free of the body. In other words, the body does some type of concealment and limitation, like he said before, on the very faculties themselves. You know, it's also bringing to mind what we learned on page 1309. So there he was talking about exactly that. We said then that the seichel gets concealed in the midas. I'm just thinking out loud because it sounds very similar to slapshus, but I don't want to, let's not confuse matters. Okay. The klolos haskoli b'chinas hametzias lavad. Because now the power of intelligence, once it's in the physical brain, in the physical body, it's now it only has the ability to understand things, conceive of things, only the existence of godliness, not the mohus, like he said before, mohusa eir eliki, now it's the mitzias of eir eliki. The existence of it, even though we don't know the personality, is similar to what he said on top of 1309, that we know that there's a soul, but we don't know the personality of the soul. So we know there's godliness, but we don't know the personality because the seichel has now entered into the physical domain of the human body. That's what he's saying here.
Rabbi
Because
Jacobson.
I read quite a few lines and we're not finished yet. I will stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
Rabbi Jacobson, I have a comment, and I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly or not, but it's if I'm on the right track, this is an amazing chidush, and that is this. In Chassidut, when somebody's blind, they don't tell you that it's a lack of light. They tell you actually it's too much light, and the vessel is not able to contain it. If that's the case, I think what Rabbi Rashab, at least that's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is what he's really saying is that true darkness is actually the abundance of light, not lack of it. And the proof to the pudding would be the makuk choshech, that it shows that it was such the level of darkness, yet the Yiddim, the Jews, were able to see. So what it shows is that they were able to see the etzem of the choshech, and that's why they saw light. And begashmiut, it was crazy darkness.
I don't know.
Darkness ultimately is actually crazy amount of light.
This is speculation. I can't comment on it. I have nothing to say. I don't see anywhere that this is hinted to here.
In this mashal, the goof is the choshech and the kochus would be the or.
I would wait till he finishes and spells it out. We're still in the middle.
Okay.
As I always do, I like to read the whole thing, and then we could see how.
But he's giving us I know he's giving us a mashal, but it's supposed to help us understand. But okay.
Yeah, but we still didn't finish the subject. So let's see how he's going to conclude. He's going to come back to it. He's giving us a mashal, but the Rebbe Rashab is going to sum it up.
Okay.
I'd wait to see how he's going to explain it. Yeah. Right now, he's giving the explanation of how the seichel comes into Bakshama. Good. Any other questions? So now he qualifies in the parentheses. So even though we just said that it's only Metzias Levad, that what we see in the divine, what we comprehend when the mind is now manifest inside a body is only Metzias. He says, but he qualifies. Rak mashayochel liyas bebchinas riyas ayin haseichel. That doesn't mean that you can't have any visualization, because there is the concept, what's possible to be seen. Riyas ayin haseichel, we know you can't see godliness, but you can have a clarity in the mind, even in the physical mind. You can have a clarity, riyas ayin haseichel, ayin haseichel. It's called like chacham einav bereisheh, which means the wise person's eyes are in his head, that the mind can't perceive something to the point that it's almost as if you actually see it. So he wants to just qualify that even though it's not quite, it's mitzias, and not like it is in Gan Eden and Lamaila, where it's muhus, you could have ariyas ayin haseichel, v'gam zeh ein b'chinas riyas hamuhus mamish. And even that, even when you have that, that's not riyas hamuhus mamish. You're not actually seeing the very personality of it. U'kameshin is bar leil dibra masl roshei hamatis hagimel. Like it was explained earlier in the third mimer, the Roshei Hamat is the third one, where he says in volume 1. So the Rebbe Rashab is simply being thorough here and adding qualification that there is, even in physical seichel below, that you could have levels of deeper understanding, but even that, riyas ayin haseichel, which is a type of riyah, not just shmiyah, not just like hearing an idea from a distance, but still, even that is not riyas mamish. But bottom line is, what he's distinguished so far is between the koiches themselves, as they are on their own, and as they manifest within the body. V'nimtza. So from this we derive, from this we conclude, from this we extract nimtza. That the comprehension of the personality of the divine is completely concealed in this enclothing and in this manifestation of the faculties inside the body. So though, yes, we have a mind and we could understand things, but hasagas hamahus gets completely concealed. So the mind on its own, like he said, is ruchni be'etzem. Even though it's a gili from the nefesh, not the nefesh itself, but it's a ruchni. When it comes into the human, into the body, into the limbs of the body, this is the concealment that takes place. And he adds, bebchinas siluk. So Nisalim itself can be concealed. Siluk means a deeper level of concealment. Let me explain the difference between Helam and Siluk. In Chassidus, it talks about that there's two types of tzimtzumim. There's a tzimtzum b'derech miyut, and there's a tzimtzum b'derech siluk. Now, tzimtzum in general can be translated concealment, contraction, but when you break it down, it can be miyut, you diminish. Let's say the light is shining 100%, and you dim the light to 10%. That's miyut. That's not siluk. Siluk is when you completely, so-called, remove it. It means complete concealment. Even though the word siluk means removal, but we know that's not tzimtzum k'pshutei. So that's why, but we use siluk because it's a complete concealment. So the tzimtzum arishin Chassidus says is b'derech siluk. That's why it says siluk eirei al asad. In Eitz Chaim, the Arizal says he removed the light. Then we explain removal means total concealment. Tzimtzum b'derech of ishtalshus, the other tzimtzumim are usually referred to as tzimtzum b'derech miyut. They're more diminishers, and they dim the light. So here he's saying, in Salam Legamri, he says in the form of siluk. That means there's a real paradigm shift. It's not just the same seichel, and there's a quantitative shift. That in Gan Eden we understand it 100%, and when the seichel goes, the intelligence is in our physical brains, we understand 40% or 10%. That would be miyut, diminished. But rather, there's a paradigm shift that we don't that when it enters the physical body, the soul's faculties change dramatically because they no longer can perceive the way it is in its pure, sublime form, in pristine form, when it's not affected by the keli being here, the limbs of the body. That's what he's essentially saying. Now, to say it's completely removed, you can't, because you could contemplate on godliness. The whole point of this mimer is that you can radiate the darkness of this world with the divine soul and this contemplation. So clearly, even the seichel, as it comes into the physical brain, has the capacity to contemplate on everything we learned before, about how godliness manifests in existence, and how godliness is the true energy of existence, and it can cause us to have a love and a reverence of God. So to say it's completely not capable, it is, but it's not the same quality as it is in as the faculties are on their own. That's the point he wants to make.
It's metzius and not mahus.
Yeah, but I explained what that means. Yeah. Fa'askolahi ba'agbola. So first he said, Nisal, there's a few things here. If you go back, you said the Lashonos he used before, he said it's Mailim, Umagbil, Umeineya. When he spoke about Cheshach, he said it conceals, it limits, and it blocks the expansion of the Ur. So the same thing now in the Nefesh, the Keches, so he says this is Slapshus. He's spoken about the Helam. Now he's speaking about the Hagbola. Yeah, he says, Keches boim b'akshama u'b'agbola b'slapshus zeis. So b'akshama. So now he spoke about Helam. Now he's saying, and also what happens is it gets limited. Before, if you remember, he said on top, it's b'chinas gili eir, b'chinas bligvul. Now, by contrast, the way it manifests inside the body, the askola is ba'agbola. So in addition to the qualitative shift of mahus to mitzias, that paradigm shift, it's also limited. How much he's capable of understanding and conceiving commensurate to the chemer hamayach, to the very physical substance and matter of the brain. Like I said before, your faculty, let's say, of the power to throw something, if it was not limited by the muscles and I guess the nerves and all the joint and everything that your hand has, it has an unlimited power. But once it manifests in the body also limits the flow. So in addition to a qualitative shift, where it's moved from a more sublime state to a more material state, so it's a different type of hasaga, instead of muhus, it's mitzias, there's also a limit. It's now far more limited. For example, Gan Eden, the neshamas don't have to go to sleep, even though there is a level of lila there, but they don't have physical fatigue, they don't have illness, they don't have the physical limits of a body. So you can learn Torah in a way, almost in an unlimited way. There's nothing that stops you except maybe simply built-in limits like Shabbos, Yom Tov, or different things the neshamas have to experience in heaven. But in the physical body limits the ability for these faculties to fully flow as they would on their own in the soul. That's what he's saying now. Okay. Now I was going to go the longer parentheses around, let's see here. Three 6-line parentheses where he's going to qualify and say, 1 second, this limit of faculties is not only due to the body. The faculties themselves have a limitation. That's what he's going to qualify in the parentheses. Actually, 8 lines. So let's do the parentheses. Anyone want, oh, you know what? Actually, it's already 10:30, so I'm going to stop here. But in this next parentheses, he's going to qualify that seemingly, he says, meaning also mitzad the koyach, there's a limit. He's going to distinguish between the koyach, the faculty itself, and the keli in which it manifests, the aver, the body, the limb, the organ, and the very keli, the container, this limitation. But he's continuing to explain this example, and he's going to come back. Remember, all this is a moshel for how darkness conceals the light that we were talking about before. But the moshel, interestingly, even though it's a moshel, it actually is the very theme he wants to explain, how we reveal godliness in this dark world. So the moshel is actually, in many ways, the cheshach was an example to this, but he's using this, it goes both ways. It's going to explain what we spoke about darkness, but it's also going to explain the very concept of how we bring godliness into this world. Okay. I'm going to stop here before the parentheses. Let me stop for questions now. I just want to say the questions that were asked before by the different people, the fact that I did not answer them is because I'm trying not to process. I'm trying to understand exactly what he's saying right now. To process would mean to start connecting this to other ideas. For me, that confuses me. So I'm just telling you, it's not because the questions don't have value, they're not valid. It's just I would wait to address them after we finish the subject matter here. Just pointing out. So I'm not trying to silence your questions, just trying to put context here.
I have a question about the distinction between the kochos and the nefesh itself. He speaks about the kochos almost as if they're separate capacities, almost independent of the nefesh. But I had understood from the very beginning of Ayin Beis and even Tanya that the kochos they're faculties of the nefesh. In other words, the nefesh is comprised of these things. There's no such thing as a nefesh that doesn't have these kochos. So it's a little confusing because here he seems to talk about them almost independently.
Well, the way it's explained is this. Your body is made up of limbs and organs. The soul is not made up of koiches. The soul is a divine energy that's seamless and shapeless, which in that energy, God invested the capacity for these faculties. So, for example, anything in the physical world, the table is made up of elements. The water is made up of oxygen and hydrogen, H2O, which in terms of its molecular structure, its atomic structure. If you dissect the soul, you're not going to just see a soul is not the sum of the parts. It's not a composite, a murkav, a composite of a bunch of 10 faculties or 1 million faculties. And the other, think of it of a seamless energy that then has the capacity for chachma, for bina, for das. So it's something in between. It's not, the koiches are not outside of the nefesh, but they're also not the ingredients of the nefesh. The nefesh has a lot more than the koiches, like he says. It's a shlelish mizeh. The nefesh is not a sum of the parts of the koiches, though it carries, like it says, nefesh noise koiches is the exact expression. It carries the capacity, just like we say God himself. God has 10 spheres, but he's not made up of 10 spheres, God forbid. The 10 spheres are 10 powers that he emanated from from a shapeless, seamless reality, which has the capacity, like we've talked about, let's say, the artist. The artist has infinite ability to create infinite types of art, and he chooses one type. And then he's not even an artist. He's not defined by being an artist. The fact that he's an artist means that he has the capacity to be an artist. There's no contradiction. There's just question of which side you're looking at. If you're looking at from the point of view of the nefesh, the koiches are more defined. If you're looking compared to the body, the koiches are actually more nafshizdik. They're more soulful, like he says here. That's the point he's making. It's like 3 stages. The nefesh, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Another example may be like white light. Light is essentially white. It's only due to a prism where you bend the light that you see colors. So is the light made up of colors? No. The light is above colors, but it also contains the capacity for the rainbow of colors. That's just another example. Not exactly, but I'll
That's not a good example. That's because this example is not a good example, and I'm looking for a physical example. You explained it beautiful, that the nefesh is not a combination from keches, but light and color light, they are all on the same level. The only difference is its colors. The nefesh is in a different level than the keches. I'm looking for a physical example for that.
Okay.
You mentioned before electricity. Electricity is also the same level before it is in a different equipment. It's the same level. The nefesh is something which is a higher level than the keches.
I discussed a number of times the idea that there's the keches hagluyim, the revealed faculties, there's the keches dalam, the concealed, there's the keches hiyulim, the keches atzmim, keches haklulim benefesh, nefesh kel keches, and nefesh neise keches, and the nefesh itself. So when you think about it, it's really coming from a shapeless place to more shape, or to more potential, like yechelis. You know, the expression we use, God's capacity, yechelis. He has the ability to do so. That doesn't mean he has a koyach. A koyach is an actual faculty. A yechelis is a capacity for that faculty. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to define it. You can
and maybe the nefesh is even above yechelis.
Well, Chassidus gives different examples of, like for example, when you have when you write letters on a page, so the page is white background, and the letters emerge. It needs the white background. The white background is pshitus, is seamless, is shapeless and seamless, but you write letters on it. So you need like the white light of a projector, and then you put a film before. So the white light is just plain white light. You put a film, and then the light shines through the film, and you see letters or shapes and images. But the white light always remains white light. I mean, there's different explanations, different examples. I think we can stop here with that. Okay, so I'm stopping here before the parentheses, where we'll talk more about the difference between the Hagbola due to the body and the Hagbola due to the very faculty itself. And then he's going to come back. He's going to continue discussing this in the context of Cheshach and everything. Okay, so I'm stopping in the middle of page